The thing with which I want to start in this course is to hook up navigation to either load recipes or the shopping list. Now, we will later learn a way to do this in the way it is meant to be done, but the solution we will create now also is very creative and not bad. I will use ngIf to only load one of the two sections at a time. So somehow in my app component probably, because that is where I include both, here I will need to manage which one should be displayed, and I should determine which one is displayed in the header component. So I should kind of pass the information which link was clicked there to my app component so that I can then switch a property there to only display one of these two components. I will admit that this task involves multiple steps. It doesn't cover anything you haven't learned thus far though. So definitely take this as a challenge to implement such a navigation on your own, emitting some event in the header which allows us to determine which component should be displayed here in the app component. Now is your chance to pause the video. We'll do it together thereafter. So were you successful? Here is my solution on how we could get this to work the way we want it to work. I'll start in the header component template. Here we got these two links, and I want to attach some click listeners to these links. Here I will say on select, and I will pass a string here, recipe maybe. We can of course pass our own data to the methods we execute here. And here I will select another one or add another click listener, and I will say on select shopping list. Now you could of course also work with numbers there or fire two totally different methods. So that is my onSelect method. Now in the header component, I of course need to implement onSelect, and we get an argument here. We pass it here, right? We get a string on what to select. So maybe let's name it feature, and that will be a string. So let's assign the type string here by adding a colon and then string thereafter. And now, as I said, I want to emit my own event. Hey, we learned how to do this. First of all, I'll need to add a new property, which I'll name feature selected. You can, of course, choose another name if you want. This should be a new event emitter. And now remember, event emitter is imported from @AngularCore. That's a generic type, and we will pass a string here, the feature which was selected in the end, and we have to add parentheses to instantiate this, so to create an object based on the event emitter class. That is our feature selected event. Now I want to use this property, which now holds this event emitter as a value, to emit an event whenever we click one of the buttons, and I will then emit feature, so this string we receive from these method calls here in our template. Well, with that in place, the missing piece is to enable this event to be listened to from outside of this component. So we have to attach something to this property to make it listenable from the parent component, the app component in this case. That something is the add_output decorator, don't forget the parentheses, which also needs to be imported from @AngularCore. add_output enables us to use this event or to listen to it from the parent component. So in the app component, which is the parent component, which adds app header here, I will listen to the feature selected event, and then here I will execute onNavigate, let's say. And of course, I'm interested in the data I'm receiving from feature selected, so I can get access to it with $event, this protected name we could use in the template to get access to any data an event passes to us. Now, just because this might be confusing, if you don't specify $event here, but other data, like we did here, right? We kind of overrode $event. That doesn't actually override it. You simply determine which data you want to pass to your own method. And $event may also be used as a second argument here. $event will always refer to the event data anywhere between these quotation marks here. So no matter which place it has in the method argument list here. So I just wanted to make sure that this doesn't lead to any confusion. So let's turn this back to $event to get access to the data we actually pass in our own event. And now in the app component TypeScript file, I will add onNavigate, and here I will receive the where should we navigate to information. So you may choose any name you want. I'll go with feature again. This is the feature we want to navigate to. And now we should make sure that we actually store this feature. So maybe here we should say loaded feature because, we store which feature should be displayed. And initially, that might be our recipes. And maybe to make sure that we always use the same string, let's check it here. Recipe is the name here, this recipe feature. So let's go with recipe here too. And then in onNavigate, I will set this loaded feature equal to the feature we receive here as an argument. And you could even omit this method and directly set loaded feature equal $event here. But I will go for the longer approach to be very explicit about what's happening here. So with that, we're getting this loaded feature. Now we can use ngIf to determine which of the two components should be displayed. App recipes should be displayed if loaded feature equals recipe, and shopping list should be displayed whenever loaded feature, let's say, does not equal recipe. So that will also catch cases where it somehow is set to something else. So with that, we're using ngIf. Now let's see if that works. We only see the recipe now. And if I click on shopping list, we see the shopping list and the other way around. So now navigation is kind of working. Again, we will later improve this, but for now, that is a great solution. Now let's move on to making the list items here real list items living in their own component. So we added navigation in the last section. Now I want to work on this list of recipe. Right now, if we have a look at its component here, we see that the code for a single list item is this one here. We do have a separate recipe item component, but right now it doesn't hold any template because we had to outsource this code and put it into this recipe list component temporarily, because otherwise we would not have been able to display our recipe data. Now we know how to pass data to a component though, so we can cut all that code here and put it into the recipe item component template. Now the goal, of course, is to get this ng for loop here and remove it from inside the item and move it back on the item here, and then pass down the individual item, the individual recipe of each iteration to that component so that we can still output recipe name and so on here. So that is your chance to do this on your own again. Pause the video and try to loop through the component itself. So get ng4 out of this component and then pass down the selected recipe or the recipe of the current loop iteration. In a few seconds, you'll see my solution. So were you successful? First of all, I'll cut the ng4 loop here and I'll go back to the recipe list component and add it to the app recipe item selector, so that now the whole component is replicated for each recipe. Now the issue, of course, is that we don't have the recipe, which we access, inside the recipe item component anymore. So we should probably add a recipe here, the recipe of that single recipe item component. It will be of type recipe, of course, so we have to import this from our own recipe model, going up 2 folders, and then it's there, right in the folder we, then moved to. And initially this will not be defined. There won't be a value assigned to it, because I want to get this recipe from outside. So to get a recipe from outside, or any data from outside, we need to add something, a decorator. at input with parentheses, which needs to be imported from at Angular core. At input allows us to bind this component property from outside. And of course, I want to bind it from my recipe list component here. So in this list where I replicate the single recipe item a couple of times. Now here, we can now bind to our recipe, referring to the property in the single recipe item, and bind the recipe of the current loop iteration. Now, I'm not happy with the naming here because that can be very confusing. We're having recipe 3 times here. So to make super clear what each name here refers to, I'll rename the recipe here in our loop to recipe L for element, and that also has to be replaced here then, because we're passing the single recipe element as a value, therefore on the right side of the equal sign, to the bindable recipe property. And keep in mind, the recipe here between the squared brackets simply is the recipe property in the component we're placing this on. So in the recipe item component, this recipe here. That is what that refers to. And actually, to make this super clear, I can split this horizontally to have the receiving component, the recipe item component, and the sending one, here template of the sending one, the recipe list component above each other. So that is what we're binding to here. So let me close this. With this, if we save that, we should see the same as before, which makes sense. It's a good thing that we see this. It means it didn't break. And it makes sense because now we're successfully passing down the data, which, keep in mind, is stored in the recipe list component here in this array. We're successfully passing this down to the recipe item component. Now let's work on the feature that once we click an item here, we actually select it and then we load it in the recipe detail component. So that is what we'll work on next.